The November wind off Lake Michigan was sharp enough to cut glass, whistling against the revolving brass doors of the Sterling Tower, but the true chill resided inside, in the steel-blue eyes of Richard Sterling. The billionaire developer strode into his lobby at exactly 8 o'clock, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the pristine marble floors. The air here smelled of expensive espresso and money, a stark contrast to the scent of bleach and old damp wool that clung to Hattie Moore's cleaning uniform. Hattie stood near the reception desk, her knuckles swollen from 40 years of wringing out mops. She shifted her weight, trying to block Sterling's view of the small figure sitting quietly on the velvet bench reserved for VIP guests. But you couldn't hide Leo. 7-year-old Leo sat with his legs dangling inches above the floor. He wore a gray hoodie that was 2 sizes too big, the fabric frayed at the cuffs, and thick, plastic-rimmed glasses that slid down his nose every few seconds. In his lap rested a book heavy enough to be a doorstop, a battered copy of Virgil's Aeneid he had rescued from a library donation bin. Sterling stopped. The clicking of his shoes ceased, silencing the entire lobby. He didn't look at Hattie, the woman who had polished his floors for a decade. He looked at Leo. "Reeves," Sterling said, his voice smooth and cold. "Since when do we allow loitering in the executive lobby? It looks like a bus station." Hattie stepped forward, her chin lifted. "He's not loitering, Mr. Sterling. School is closed for heating repairs. He's waiting for my shift to end. He's quiet." Sterling let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He walked over to the bench, towering over the boy. "Quiet? With that hoodie, I assumed he was scouting the place for his friends. That's the uniform of trouble, isn't it?" The receptionists looked down at their desks. The security guard shifted uncomfortably. But Leo didn't shrink. He pushed his glasses up his nose, marked his page with a slender finger, and looked up. "Clothes do not make the man, sir," Leo said softly, his voice clear. "Or the boy." Sterling blinked. The audacity of a child speaking back, a child from the South Side, no less, momentarily stunned him. "You have a mouth on you," Sterling sneered. "I suppose you think you're smart because you can carry a big book?" He gestured grandly to the center of the lobby, where a thick, ancient document lay protected inside a bulletproof glass case. It was the original deed of trust for the land the tower stood on, a mix of archaic languages meant to intimidate anyone who looked at it. "That document represents power," Sterling said, raising his voice so his staff could hear the performance. "It's history. It's legacy. Things people like you don't understand." He leaned in, a cruel glint in his eye. "I'll tell you what, kid. I'm feeling generous today. I will pay you $2 million right here, right now, if you can read a single sentence of that document. Not guess it. Read it." Hattie gasped. "Mr. Sterling, please. Don't mock him." "I'm not mocking him, Hattie. I'm teaching him his place." Leo closed his book. The sound was soft, like a period at the end of a sentence. He slid off the velvet bench. His sneakers squeaked slightly on the marble as he walked toward the imposing glass case. He looked small against the towering architecture, a speck of gray in a world of gold. He stopped in front of the yellowed parchment. He studied the swirling ink, the faded letters that had confused lawyers for a century. Then he turned back to the billionaire. "Sir," Leo said, his voice ringing through the cavernous hall without a tremor. "If I read this, will you keep your word? Or is your promise as empty as this lobby?" The silence that descended on the Sterling Tower lobby was heavy enough to weigh on the shoulders. The only sound was the soft squeak of Leo's worn rubber soles against the marble as he adjusted his stance in front of the imposing glass case. Leo pushed his glasses up his nose again, a nervous tic he had picked up from Mr. Gable, the old librarian who let him sit in the dusty archives when the heating at home failed. "Latin isn't dead, Leo," Mr. Gable had whispered over the tomes. "It's just sleeping. You have to wake it up gently." Leo took a deep breath and woke it up. He didn't start with a stutter or a guess. He began with the first line, written in a dense, spiky old English script. "Wait. We Gardena in Girdigum." His voice was small but resonant, carrying a rhythm that belonged to a different century, cutting through the modern hum of the HVAC system. Sterling's smirk didn't vanish instantly. It froze, creating a grotesque mask of amusement that no longer reached his eyes. Leo moved his finger against the glass, not touching it, just tracing the line to the second paragraph. The language shifts here, Leo explained calmly, as if he were reading a lunch menu. It becomes Latin. Dominium non est possessio, said Ministerium. He paused, turning his head slightly toward the billionaire. It translates to, dominion is not possession, but stewardship. A murmur rippled through the crowd of receptionists and junior executives who had gathered. Phones were raised, camera lenses winking like frantic eyes. Leo didn't look back. He was in the flow now, the bridge between the ink and the air. He switched to the Greek section, his pronunciation crisp, unforced. It continues, Leo said, his voice gaining strength. It says that the land outlives the king, and that he who hoards the harvest without sharing the grain shall eat only dust. Sterling took a step back, his face draining of color. The perspiration beating on his forehead wasn't from the heat, it was the cold sweat of a man realizing the weapon he had handed a child was loaded. This wasn't just a legal document Leo was reading. It was a moral indictment, and every word felt like a verdict delivered personally to the man in the Italian suit. Stop, Sterling whispered, but the word was too weak to travel. Leo reached the final line, a script that looked like decorative art to everyone else in the room. Sanskrit, Leo said softly. Satyam eva jayate. He turned fully to face the billionaire, his expression devoid of arrogance, filled only with a quiet, terrifying certainty. Truth alone triumphs. For a heartbeat, the lobby felt like a cathedral. Someone near the elevators started to clap a solitary sharp sound before their colleague hushed them. Then the spell broke. Sterling's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The humiliation burned hotter than the financial threat. He lunged forward, his composure shattering like dropped glass. Enough, he roared, his voice cracking. This is a setup. A parlor trick. He pointed a shaking finger at Hattie, who stood with her hand over her mouth. You fed him the lines. It's a scam. He spun toward the security desk, eyes wild. Security. Get this fraud and his grandmother out of my building. Now. Throw them into the street. The revolving brass doors spun Hattie and Leo out onto the sidewalk, spitting them from the golden warmth of the tower into the teeth of a Chicago November. The wind, the infamous hawk that locals whispered about with dread, hit them instantly, stinging their eyes and biting through Hattie's thin uniform coat. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the icy knot of injustice tightening in Hattie's chest. She gripped Leo's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. Her hand was rough, calloused from years of scrubbing other people's messes, but it was warm. It was safe. It was the only shield Leo had against a city that had just decided he was a threat. Grandma. Leo's voice was barely audible over the roar of rush-hour traffic. He looked up, his glasses fogging in the chill. Did I do something bad? Is that why he yelled? Hattie stopped right there on the busy pavement, ignoring the businessmen rushing past who clicked their tongues at the obstruction. She knelt down, ignoring the ache in her knees, until she was eye level with the boy in the gray hoodie. No, baby, she said, her voice fierce and steady. You did something brave. And sometimes, brave makes small men feel afraid. That man in there? He's very small, no matter how tall his building is. They walked to the L station, the elevated train tracks shuddering overhead like a metallic beast. Inside the train car, the air smelled of wet wool and fatigue. They found 2 seats near the back. Hattie stared out the window as the city of Chicago slid by from the gleaming glass spires of the Loop to the brick-and-mortar grid of the South Side. Across the aisle, a college student with purple hair was scrolling on her phone. She glanced up, looked at Leo, then looked back at her screen. Her eyes widened. She nudged her friend, whispering loudly. That's him, the student said, leaning forward. Hey, are you the kid? From the video. Hattie stiffened, pulling Leo closer. We don't want any trouble, miss. The girl turned her phone screen toward them. No, look. It's everywhere. Hoodie Kid versus Billionaire. It's been up for 2 hours and it already has 1 million views. People are going crazy. They're calling him a genius. Leo peered at the screen. There he was, grainy and small, standing in front of the glass case, his voice ringing out, "Truth alone triumphs." Beneath the video, comments scrolled faster than he could read. He destroyed him. Look at Sterling's face. Give the kid the money. They believe me? Leo whispered, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes. The people do, Hattie said, a grin set to her jaw. But Richard Sterling isn't people. He's a shark. She was right. At that very moment, 40 floors up in the Sterling Tower, Richard Sterling was pacing his office. The view of Lake Michigan was breathtaking, but Sterling saw none of it. He was on the phone with his legal team, his voice low and dangerous. I don't care about the video, Sterling hissed. Control the narrative. Paint the grandmother as a grifter. Say she has a history of fraud. Say the kid had an earpiece. Destroy their credibility before the morning news cycle. And Reeves? Make sure the cleaning company terminates her contract effective immediately. I want them starving by dinner. By the time Hattie unlocked the door to their small apartment on the south side, the sanctuary she had built felt fragile. The smell of leftover grits and cinnamon usually welcomed them, but today the air felt heavy. Hattie sat on the worn sofa, her legs trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Leo went straight to his bookshelf planks of wood supported by cinder blocks and pulled down a book, needing the comfort of words that didn't lie. Then Hattie's phone buzzed. A harsh, mechanical vibration on the coffee table. She picked it up. A text message from her supervisor. Mrs. Moore. Due to the incident at the tower today, your employment is terminated. Do not return to the premises. Legal action pending regarding the security breach. Hattie stared at the screen. No severance. No explanation. Just erased, like a smudge on a window. Before she could even process the grief, a heavy pounding shook their front door. Bam. 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 Hattie jumped. She moved to the window and peered through the blinds. Down on the street, where usually only neighbors walked, 3 news vans were double-parked. Men with cameras were setting up on the sidewalk, their lenses pointed up at her window like rifles. Sterling hadn't just fired her. He had thrown them to the wolves. Grandma. Leo stood holding his book, his eyes wide behind his glasses. Who is it? Hattie turned from the window. The fear in her chest evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard resolve of a woman who had survived winters far worse than this. She looked at the text message one last time, then deleted it. It's the fight, Leo, she said, walking over to the landline phone on the kitchen wall. She picked up the receiver and dialed a number she had memorized years ago, the number of Mr. Gable, the librarian, and the only man she knew who hated bullies as much as she did. Allo, Mr. Gable? Hattie's voice didn't shake. They say my grandson cheated. They say I'm a thief. We're going to need witnesses. And we're going to need your biggest dictionary. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel was designed to make people feel small. With its vaulted ceilings frescoed with Greek gods and chandeliers the size of small cars, it was a temple of wealth, exactly the kind of arena Richard Sterling chose for a public execution. But Leo, sitting on a velvet chair that was far too high for his short legs, didn't look small. He looked patient. The room was packed. 300 reporters, socialites, and skeptics squeezed into the gilded rows. Cameras formed a black wall of lenses at the back, red recording lights blinking like unblinking eyes. The air was stifling, hot from the lights and thick with the scent of expensive perfume and anticipation. Sterling paced the stage like a ringmaster. He had regained his color and his confidence. He wore a fresh suit, navy blue, and a microphone clipped to his lapel that amplified his voice to a godlike boom. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling announced, spreading his arms wide. We are here today to seek the truth. I have been accused of reneging on a promise. But a promise made to a fraud is no promise at all. Today we expose the trick. He gestured to a severe-looking man standing next to a whiteboard covered in dense text. I present Dr. Aris, Chair of Linguistics at the University of Chicago. He has selected texts that no 7-year-old could possibly memorize. Texts that haven't been digitized. Texts that require a soul to understand, not just a memory chip. Hattie sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles ached. Beside her, Mr. Gable, the librarian, patted her arm gently. Steady, Hattie, he whispered. The truth doesn't need to shout. Let's begin, Sterling sneered, turning to Leo. Dr. Aris, show him the first piece. The professor revealed a poster board. It wasn't English. It wasn't even Latin. It was Middle English, a dense, thorny script from the 14th century regarding land disputes. "Read it," Sterling commanded. "And don't look at your grandmother." Leo adjusted his glasses. He looked at the board, blinking once against the glare of the spotlights. Then he began to speak. His voice was soft, forcing the room to lean in, forcing the cameras to zoom. "One that the night had thus his tale white-told." Leo didn't stumble. He navigated the guttural vowels and the rolling consonants with the ease of someone walking through their own backyard. He didn't just read the sounds, he captured the cadence. When he reached a word that Sterling had mispronounced earlier in his introduction, Domain Leo pronounced it correctly, with a subtle French lilt. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Sterling's jaw tightened. This wasn't going according to the script. "Fine," Sterling snapped, cutting Leo off. "Memorization. Anyone can learn sounds like a parrot. Dr. Eris, bring out the final test. The one we discussed. The philosophy manuscript." Dr. Eris hesitated. He looked at the boy, then at the billionaire. Slowly, he placed a replica of a fragile, ancient page on the easel. It was Latin, but not the simple Latin of church hymns. This was dense, complex political philosophy from the Roman Senate. "Translate it," Sterling challenged, crossing his arms. "Tell these people what it means. If you can." Leo stared at the text. The room went deathly silent. For a long moment, Leo said nothing. Sterling's smile began to creep back. "See? Silence. The earpiece stopped working, didn't it?" "No, sir," Leo said. He turned to face Sterling, his expression solemn. "I was just thinking about how sad the words are." "Sad?" Sterling laughed. "It's a text about power. Read it." "Okay," Leo said. He began to translate, not word for word, but thought for thought. The text says that a man who builds his house on the backs of others will never sleep soundly, for he will always fear the shaking of the floor. Sterling's smile vanished. Leo continued, his voice growing stronger, filling the ballroom. "It says that true nobility is not found in gold, which is cold and heavy, but in the hand that reaches down to lift the fallen. It says that a ruler without mercy is just a beggar in a crown." Leo stopped. He took off his glasses and looked directly at Richard Sterling. The connection was electric. The words hung in the air, vibrating with a truth that stripped away the billionaire's suit, his tower, and his money. Sterling opened his mouth to shout, to interrupt, to call it a lie, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that the boy wasn't just reading the text. He was reading him. Then, Dr. Eris stepped forward. He walked past Sterling, ignoring the billionaire entirely, and approached Leo's chair. The stern professor looked shaken. He leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Eris said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I have studied this text for 30 years. I have translated it a dozen times." He looked at the audience, then back at the boy. "But I have never heard it understood so perfectly." The applause that followed Dr. Eris's declaration eventually died down, leaving a vacuum of silence in the grand ballroom that felt even louder than the noise. In that silence, a distinct, sharp sound cut through the air, the scratch of a fountain pen on expensive paper. Richard Sterling had retreated to the podium. His face was pale, his composure fractured, but his instincts for self-preservation were still intact. If he couldn't win the intellectual battle, he would win the transaction. He would do what men like him always did. He would buy his way out of the awkwardness. He ripped the check from his book with a violent tear. He walked back to the center of the stage, the slip of paper held out like a weapon. "There," Sterling said, his voice tight, lacking its usual boom. $2 million. As promised. He thrust the check toward Leo, fluttering it slightly. "Take it, kid. You won. Go buy yourself a new house. Get your grandmother out of that uniform. Change your life." The cameras zoomed in, waiting for the snatch. Waiting for the moment greed took over, proving that in the end, everyone had a price. Hattie stood up from her seat in the front row. She walked up the stairs to the stage, her movement slow and deliberate. She didn't look at the check. She looked at Sterling's eyes. She remembered the cold wind on the sidewalk, the eviction threat, the way he had looked at her grandson like he was trash on a shoe. "Mr. Sterling," Hattie said, her voice amplified by the nearby microphone. "You think this money fixes the insult? You think you can buy back the dignity you tried to steal?" "It's $2 million, Hattie." Sterling snapped, his patience fraying. "Don't be a fool. Take it and go." Leo stood up on his chair. He reached out, not to take the check, but to gently push Sterling's hand away. The movement was so soft, so dismissing, that Sterling froze. "I don't want it," Leo said. A gasp went through the room. A reporter near the front dropped his notepad. "Excuse me." Sterling blinked, genuinely confused. "You don't want it? It's a fortune. It's more money than you'll ever see in 10 lifetimes." "I don't want it for me," Leo clarified. He adjusted his glasses, looking out at the sea of faces, then back at the billionaire. "If I take this, I'm just a rich kid in a hoodie, and you're just a man who paid to make a problem go away." Leo took a step closer. "I want you to keep the money, but you have to spend it on what I say." Sterling lowered his hand slowly. "And what is that?" "A library," Leo said firmly. "In the South Side, where I live. A real one, with windows that don't leak and heating that works. And it has to be free. For everyone. For every kid who looks like me and gets told they can't read." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. "You want me to build a library?" Sterling asked, the arrogance draining out of his posture, replaced by bewilderment. "Yes," Leo said. "And you have to name it the Open Door. Because that's what books are." For the first time in his career, Richard Sterling looked small. He looked down at the check in his hand, a piece of paper that represented his power, and then at the boy who had just rejected it. He realized, with a jolt that shook him to his core, that this child was richer than he was. Leo possessed something Sterling's billions couldn't purchase, a soul that couldn't be bought. The audience erupted. It wasn't polite applause this time. It was a roar. People stood on their chairs. Dr. Aris was clapping so hard his hands shook. Even the cynical reporters were on their feet. Sterling looked at the crowd, then back at Leo. The billionaire's shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him. He slowly folded the check and put it back in his pocket. "A library," Sterling murmured, his voice caught by the microphone, sounding strangely human for the first time. He looked at Leo, really looked at him, not as a prop, but as a person. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "All right. You have a deal." 6 months later, the brutal Chicago winter finally released its grip. The ice on Lake Michigan cracked and melted, retreating into the deep blue water, and green shoots began to push their way through the cracks in the sidewalk concrete. It was Easter week, a time of rebirth, and on the corner of 63rd and Halsted in the South Side, something new had bloomed. It wasn't a flower. It was a building. Above the wide glass doors, gleaming in the April sunlight, silver letters spelled out, "The Open Door Library." Inside, the air didn't smell of old soup or damp wool. It smelled of fresh paper, pine wood, and possibility. The space was filled with light and children. Dozens of them. Some sat on beanbag chairs, others lay on the heated floors, all of them holding books. And in the center of it all, sitting in a modest wooden chair, was Leo. He was reading the Odyssey to a group of wide-eyed first graders. He still wore a hoodie, but it fit him better now, and his glasses sat firmly on his nose. Hattie watched from the back of the room. She wasn't wearing her cleaning uniform. Today, she wore her Sunday best, a floral dress and a hat with a small ribbon. She held a cup of punch, her eyes crinkling with a peace she hadn't felt in 40 years. The bell above the door chimed. The room didn't go silent this time. The hum of reading continued. A man walked in. He was alone. No entourage. No cameras. No Italian suit, just a simple gray blazer and slacks. It was Richard Sterling. He looked different. The sharp, predatory edge was gone, smoothed down by a humility that had been forced upon him and then, slowly, accepted. He stood by the entrance, looking at the rows of books, the sunlight, the children who were safe and warm. He saw Hattie. He hesitated, then walked over to her. He didn't offer a handshake, knowing he hadn't earned that right yet. Instead, he simply nodded. "The heating," Sterling said quietly, gesturing to the vents. Is it working properly? It's perfect, Mr. Sterling, Hattie replied, her voice even. Warm enough to sleep in. Sterling looked at Leo. The boy paused his reading, sensing the change in the room. Leo looked up. The last time they had met, they were enemies on a stage. Now, they were just two people standing in a house built on a hard lesson. Sterling cleared his throat. He's a good reader, the billionaire said, awkward but sincere. You raised a good man, Mrs. Moore. I know, Hattie said softly. I always knew. It just took you a while to see it. Leo closed his book. He didn't run over to thank the benefactor. He didn't bow. He simply lifted the book in his hand, a silent salute. A gesture of truce. Sterling returned the nod, a small, genuine smile touching his lips, the first real smile anyone had seen on his face in years. He turned and walked out the door, back into the city, leaving the space to the people it belonged to. Leo turned back to the children. Okay, he whispered, opening the book again. Where were we? Ah, yes. The part where the storm ends, and the hero finally finds his way home. Outside, the spring wind blew through Chicago, no longer a biting hawk, but a gentle breeze carrying the scent of turning pages. In the end, the towering skyscraper of Richard Sterling still stands, cold and imposing against the Chicago skyline. But in the shadow of the South Side, something far stronger has taken root. Leo didn't just win a bet. He taught us that dignity is the one currency that cannot be printed, traded, or stolen. He showed us that true wealth isn't found in what we hoard for ourselves, but in what we refuse to keep. Like the ancient texts Leo read, the lesson here is timeless. Never judge a book by its cover, and never underestimate the quiet power of a child who knows who he is. We often think we need to shout to be heard, but sometimes the loudest change comes from a whisper that says, I deserve to be here. If Leo's courage touched a chord in your heart today, take a moment to look around your own community. Maybe there's a voice waiting to be heard, or a hand waiting to be held. Share this story if you believe that kindness is the only language we all need to speak fluently.